Well, good evening, everybody. As Pastor Brad just mentioned, I've got a presentation tonight on, well, particularly on the war in the Ukraine, but more what the potential of that can lead to. It's will take about an hour, but there are a few news clips in there, and they should break it up a little bit. So I hope it keeps you connected to it and that we can get through it. And just be encouraged by what we see, I suppose. I'll put the presentation up on the screen and then we can make a start. Right, now hopefully you can all see that now. So the Ukraine's actually a country that I've visited a few times. We've back about 4, 5, 6 years ago, we had a few saints living there, and Hungary, where I was living, was actually located next to the Ukraine. There's a small border between Hungary and the Ukraine. So I've had the opportunity to visit the country. I've seen some of the things there, some of the peoples there, and the way that they live. I think we were all very surprised to hear the news on February the 24th about the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian forces. There was a lot of things happening in the build up to that, so I suppose it didn't come as a complete surprise. But still, I think, you know, we were a little bit shocked to see that happening, if you remember back to those days, and a bit wondering now what's going to happen. Now, time has passed, and as the human brain works, I think we sort of get used to, these things. We sort of get used to, okay, this is going on now, and maybe, past, I think, 2 months now since the war there started, or since this military operation there started. And now we're maybe not so much thinking about it. But remember back to the time when it all happened, and it was really something that was on our minds, a lot of people's minds as well. So what I'm going to start with is just a few scriptures from the Bible. These are very well known. I'm not going to read them out. You can just, you see them yourselves. But one thing that Jesus was critical of here in Matthew 16 was that people can be spend a lot of time and energy just thinking about, certain aspects of life. Like the thing that was mentioned here was, what the weather's going to be like. But there's so many other things that we do spend time and energy just contemplating and trying to make our plans, in anticipation of what will come. But what Jesus mentioned here was that the most important thing, I suppose, or this major event which is going to take place, which is going to be the end of the world, there is, I suppose, there's a lot less energy and a lot less thought going into trying to see when will that happen, or how will that happen. I mean, I'm speaking generally here, people in the world, what they concern themselves with. Though there has been a bit more talk about it since this invasion, but in general, it doesn't really register on the radar. People don't really spend much time thinking about it. Now, maybe we have more opportunity to talk to people because they're a bit more open. But before this event took place, it was probably very hard to even speak to people about this. So Jesus saw this all that time ago, that there would be this time, or there would be, this general approach, or this general, I suppose approach is the right word, that people don't spend too much time on this subject. So that's why we're happy to sort of show these presentations, because we would like people to spend more time thinking about these things and just wondering, where it can all lead to. When Jesus, in another interpretation of this scripture here in Matthew 16, Jesus actually another word he used was, how is it you cannot interpret the signs of the times? So what we're wanting to do is to make sure we're not in that category, that we're not part of these, the people that Jesus was speaking about here, to say that we're not capable of interpreting the signs, and that things take us by surprise, I suppose. So a question which probably would come up in people's minds, a few times in their lifetime, even if they're religious or not, or following the Lord or not, was that, well, how is it all going to end? I can remember as a kid just trying to contemplate, not being in the Lord and just going to school and just thinking, well, this world could end one day, and if it was going to end, well, how would it end? And I'm sure there's many people who've had, similar thoughts throughout the time. And it's not actually new that men and women contemplate this from time to time. I mean, our lives are very busy and we go on and do our things. Of course, our days are filled. But there's, times where we would just want to know a bit more about this. And Jesus himself, living here on the earth all these thousands of years ago, when they recognized that he's somebody of authority when it comes to these things, or comes to God and maybe an eternal plan, they took the opportunity to ask him, how will it happen? So it's something which you could say has been on the minds of men and women for a great number of years, and rightly so. So a lot of the scriptures already. In Matthew 24, Jesus talks about signs. And he says, when you shall see these things, then you know that it's near. And so near, that's even at the doors, is the expression used here. So if you think about your home, or you think about, your office, and if someone's standing right outside your door, you really know, it's close. You really know it's time. And the impression that Jesus was giving here was that when you can see these things happening, that's how you should think about, the time coming where the world will end. You've got to think about it as being at the door. And this is what, when we, examine what the scriptures say, this is what we really feel the time that we are at now. And we've been talking about topics like this, of course, I've been talking about it for 30 years, because that's how long I've been in the Lord for, but there's been people who've been a lot more in the Lord, a lot more time in the Lord than me. And so you can say, yeah, we've been talking about this for a long time. But in particular about what's happening now in the Ukraine, it doesn't put it outside the scope of possibilities. And things with these when we're talking about armed conflicts, you can't control everything which happens. It's very difficult to do so. And what we're seeing now, it can quite easily develop into something much greater than what we have at the moment. So we shouldn't feel so much at ease. Maybe a couple of months has passed, and maybe, we're still hearing things are happening. Of course, a lot of bad things are happening, but it's sort of time's ticking on, and, life goes on type thing. But just, remember this phrase here of even at the doors, how close these things can be to us now. So when we talk about, people in general, I suppose this is where most of them will be at when it does actually happen. It'll be like a thief in the night. And the thing about the thief in the night is that if you knew he was coming, of course, you would stay awake and you'd be prepared. And it has a message for us as well, just to make sure that we are awake and that we are prepared for this day coming. Now, what I've got for you after that short introduction of just a few scriptures, what I've got for you is actually a few news clips. And this one was probably one of the first interviews that the president of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, gave to an American television network. And there's a question posed here by the presenter about this conflict possibly slipping into World War III. So I'd just like you to have a listen, and I'll start the clip, but if there's no sound, please indicate to me. We did test it before, it was working, but you never know with these things. So just listen to the response.
Biden has been very clear. He's worried about provocations that could trigger World War III. Do you understand his concern there? And do you agree that it wouldn't take much to end up in World War III?
Well, nobody knows whether it may have or it started, and what is the possibility of this war if Ukraine will fall, in case Ukraine will fall. It's very hard to say, and we've seen this 80 years ago when the Second World War has started. And there were similar tragedies in the history. Nobody would be able to predict when the full-scale war would start and how it will end. Who will put an end to that? In this case, we have the whole civilization at stake.
So that's the quote there that we just ended that news clip with. And when you look at this quote, the question is this an exaggeration? So obviously this, the president of Ukraine, his country is being attacked, and maybe he's just overstating the situation and trying to be a bit dramatic about it. But when you look at what's actually going on, you can quite easily see how this can actually be a threat to the whole civilization, or to the people, to the human race even. So is this really an exaggeration? Not, I would say not. It's not. So I'll look at a few more things regarding this. This is of course, you can see the dates up here as well. So this is an interview from the 16th of April. So President Zelensky became very popular, of course, on the American news channels, and everyone wanted to have an interview with him. And this one was actually done face-to-face by the reporter here from CNN. And again, it's a quote from the president of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, saying that the world should be prepared for the possibility that Putin could use nuclear weapons. And discussion about nuclear warfare and nuclear weapons, for the most part of the last 40 years, I suppose, there hasn't been all that much discussion about it. Well, maybe more since the breakup of the Soviet Union. Of course, we had the Cold War, and many of us would have lived through that. And there was a lot of discussion about the possibility. But since the USSR broke up, things seem to sort of quieten down. But now it's sort of back on the table. And it's something which we are trying to contemplate or consider, would it be possible that we would actually see this now with what's going on? I'll play you another news clip now. This is from the ABC News channel here in Australia. This is from the 28th of April, so we're talking about nearly a month ago. And this clip reports or shows some footage of President Putin speaking in the Russian parliament and what he said there.
But Russia says there'll be more retaliation if Western nations interfere in the war here. Vladimir Putin made the comments during a speech to politicians in St. Petersburg.
Our strikes and retaliation for this will be lightning fast. We have the tools for this, things no one else can boast of having now. And we will not boast either, but will use them if necessary. And I want everyone to know that.
So the Russian government and the president of Russia is openly stating that in certain circumstances, he would be prepared to use a lot of his new weaponry if it was necessary. So we get a picture here that if he's backed into a corner or maybe becomes desperate, that it's not outside of his thinking that certain weapons which can cause a lot of destruction can be deployed and used in his mind. And don't forget that basically President Putin runs everything in Russia as a one-man show type thing. And during this conflict, the Russians have been testing these capabilities that they have. So they've been testing weapons that have been in development for some time to show the world that they are actually serious about this. So this news article is here is from the 21st 21st of April. Don't know if I do this. Does it actually highlight on the screen? You can see the date up here in the corner, 21st of April up there. And this was a test of a new intercontinental ballistic weapon. Now, these are the type of weapons which carry nuclear warheads. That's why they're so important. And the test was made to show the world that it actually works. It's it's capable of striking targets. And I just, the news clip here says that this should give the Western world food for thought to sort of see that what they're capable of. And we talk about weapons, and of course, we don't want to get lost in all the different terminologies. Otherwise, we'd probably all fall asleep. But just this missile here, which was tested, called the Samut Missile. You can see the name just over here, if you can see that. I don't know if you can or not. But this is a missile which can fly 35,000 kilometres. That's quite a long way, right? And it can carry 15 nuclear warheads in the one missile. So they're really up there, I suppose, you'd have to say, with the technology and what what it can do. I mean, I'm quite surprised a missile can fly 35,000 kilometres and carry 15 nuclear warheads. So it potentially could attack 15 cities in the one go. And this bit here, this was a news clip from Al Jazeera. You can see here on the bottom, this mentioned that the risk of nuclear war has increased since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think that's becoming very clear. So you were seeing, major figures of this world, like the UN Secretary General, stating that nuclear war is back within the realm of possibility. I think that's what we're all coming to terms with. We thought in the last, couple of decades, at least, that we don't have to worry about that anymore. It's something which is, is sort of under control. But just all of a sudden, a simple turn of events has taken place. I suppose it's not so simple, but sort of like it's in a period of time. It's a very short period of what's happened. And now we have major political figures of this world, people running this world saying, we can't cut out the possibility of this actually happening. And these are just 3 news clips that I've marched together, but you can read them here, and there's many more. You've got people here who are very rich in this world, like George Soros, originally Hungarian, by the way, said that the Ukraine invasion may be the start of the World War III. You've got President Trump saying nuclear war is more likely to happen than not. And you've got the first one at the top there, Putin's ally warns World War III is coming unless the West stops supplying weapons to Ukraine. That ally, by the way, is Belarus, a country who is an ally of Russia, north of Ukraine. And they have just been sold. So Belarus has now been able to purchase missiles from Russia. They haven't been able to do so before, but these missiles can carry nuclear warheads as well. So they've been given the capability, the Belarusians, to also deliver nuclear weapons. They don't have any. They're giving them back to Russia. But this is something which is, again, just sort of beefing up this potential conflict that we can see can very easily spiral into, what we would refer to as being World War III. Now, I have another news clip for you here. And this gentleman you can see on the picture is the director of the CIA, so the Central Intelligence Agency in the US. He's obviously a person who knows a lot more about what's going on than we do in the world, has access to this information. Interestingly enough, this title of this article was a quote from Khrushchev's great-granddaughter, that she thinks Putin is prepared to use nuclear weapons. You can see that written there. So this is from the 17th of April. and just listen to what he has to say.
In Putin's war has yet to be written as he grinds away at Ukraine. I have no doubt about the cruel pain and damage that Putin can continue to inflict on Ukraine, or the raw brutality with which Russian force is being applied. The crimes in Bucha are horrific. Given the potential desperation of President Putin and the Russian leadership, given the setbacks that they've faced so far militarily, none of us can take lightly the threat posed by a potential resort to tactical nuclear weapons or low-yield nuclear weapons.
So again, it's just another confirmation that these things would be possible. They're seeing that it would be possible for the Russians to use what he mentioned here as low-grade nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons. You might not have heard that term before, and I will explain a little bit what that means. So during the Cold War, countries were working very hard to arm themselves, and of course, one of the weapons that they were developing was a nuclear bomb. Now, the Americans have developed nuclear weapons that can destroy cities, so large nuclear bombs, which can annihilate complete cities in one hit. So they have these types of nuclear weapons and nothing else. But the Russians, they developed these weapons as well. So they developed nuclear bombs that can destroy cities in the one hit. But they also developed a different type of a nuclear weapon, which is called a tactical nuclear weapon or a low-yield nuclear weapon. Now, what that means is that it doesn't have a very wide blast area, so it can be much more smaller and can be used, for example, in a battle. So if you've got a battle and you need an area to be cleared, you could actually deploy a tactical nuclear weapon. It would clear that area. It is a nuclear weapon, but it's a very low grade, and it's a very small nuclear weapon. And then you could continue on with the fight. Now, the Russians developed these weapons when the Americans didn't. So the Americans didn't go ahead with any of this program, but the Russians did. So they do have available these tactical nuclear weapons. Now, for us, a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. It doesn't really matter if you call it this or that. So I suppose the thing here is that in the mindset of the Russian leader, this type of weapon is deployable in certain circumstances. But you could imagine if he did deploy such a weapon, how the West would respond to this. We would see it as a nuclear attack, I suppose, in our definition of what that means. So that's what the CIA director was referring to. We're not trying to, exaggerate his words, but just trying to explain the situation so that we can understand it. Now, where did all this come from? Has this come out of the blue? Like, has this come just from one day to the next without seeing any signs? I think no. So I can take you back now to 2014. And President Putin he gives a speech every year, once a year at this Valdia Institute. And in 2014, just after the Russians had annexed Crimea. So if you can remember back to 2014, in March in 2014, the Russians annexed Crimea. And now in October, he gives a speech at this Valdia Institute. In the meantime, the West applied sanctions to Russia. And this speech wasn't very well reported in Western media. I think I had to find the translation of this elsewhere. It wasn't in Western media. But I'd like to show you one of the quotes. This is with the translation. He said that playtime is over, right? I think the effect of the Western sanctions on him and the way that he was treated after annexing Crimea brought him to this point. And the quote that I have from him was that Russia sees the outbreak of global war as almost inevitable. So this is 8 years ago. We're not talking about this being said in the last, since in the last 6 months. And I think that when we go back and we look at these things, what has been said, it doesn't really come as a surprise of where we're heading to. And of course, leaders of countries can, they're political people. I mean, they're in politics. They can say things like this just to sort of, strengthen their position or to put fear in the other side. Of course, all these things can happen. There's a lot of rhetoric which goes on, is what I'm saying. But it doesn't mean that we can just brush aside everything that they say. So I find this really to tell a story or to show the mindset. And there's a lot more detail that I could go into regarding this, but Russia believes it needs to balance world powers. Russia believes that if they didn't exist, only the Americans would have absolute power over the world, and that would be worse for the world as a whole. There needs to be a balance, a polis, and they believe that they are this polis to the American way. So that was 2014, as I mentioned. Now, I have a clip here from 2021, so this is a year ago. This was during the Russian elections. I suppose we find it very hard to call them elections because we obviously think that they are very heavily rigged. But he was in his campaign, so this was President Putin's campaign, and I want you to listen to what he says here. How is the sound, by the way? I see a few people getting closer to the screens when the clips come up, so I suppose the sound is a bit softer. I'm sorry about that, but hopefully you can hear it.
In front of a massive video screen, Putin revealed several weapon systems.
Then, in reference to the United States pulling out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, Putin added ominously, "They kept ignoring us, so listen to us now." It was a provocative Cold War-style threat, and the audience of lawmakers and business leaders loved it. They gathered for the annual State of the Nation address, but with a presidential election in just a few weeks, it was also a chance for Russians to hear what they could expect from 6 more years of Putin. And the answer was clearly a bigger, more aggressive military.
So a bigger, more aggressive military. That was the promise. And there is a whole explanation from the Russian side. I mean, living in Hungary, I probably got a lot more news from the Russian side as well as the Western news. I find in Australia, probably, it's more lopsided toward the Western view. But the Russians have their reasons, and they believe they're right in what they're doing. It's very hard for us to contemplate this from the Western side and from the Western world, but they do see things which they believe is worth counteracting. And the development of their weapons, so the one that I showed you, that missile, the Samut, and how far it can fly and how many warheads it can bring, it's been one of the weapons that they've been developing over the past decade. They've put a lot of money and research into these things. They're developing an underwater missile that can be fired from a submarine, which is also capable of carrying a nuclear weapon. And all this has come about. Russia's been very upset with. There were 3 major treaties signed during the Cold War because Russia and America both recognized that they have to restrict the development of weapons to certain levels. And the one that was referred to in this clip was the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And that was a treaty that the Americans decided to pull out of. Why? Because it allowed them to develop anti-missile systems. So the anti-missile system, sorry if this is getting a bit too technical, but the anti-missile systems is that when, say, Russia fires a missile, the Americans can actually strike that missile while it's still in the air. It's an anti-missile system. And the Russians never developed such a system. They don't have such a system. So they were saying that if there is a nuclear attack from America and the Russians would fire their nuclear weapons at America, the Americans would have a very strong possibility or likelihood of shooting down their nuclear weapons. So they said, well, the Americans here have a strategic advantage over us, and this mutual destruction wouldn't be of any use. So they developed weapons which could overwhelm any such defense systems. Okay, we'll try to talk less about weapons. But it's all very technical and all very interesting, or how it's all developed and played out. So the quote from Jesus was, "It's even at the doors." That was the quote. When you see certain signs taking place, not particularly speaking here about nuclear warfare and other signs, but when you see these things take place, just be aware and be awake. So then we come to Bible prophecy. In the minds of many, they would say, well, if there's a God, and God is behind the book called the Bible, and there would be such an event which would end the world, well, would God foresee that? Or could we find references in the Bible to any such happening? Now, of course, we do see a lot of things in the Bible regarding this, which is quite amazing in itself, because some of these, things were written 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. Some of the prophets saw these things as actually coming, and we can refer to these things at this time. And I have just one or two of these for you from the Bible today, but there's here the scripture in Zechariah where it talks about a plague which will come upon those people which fought against Jerusalem. Right now, here we've shifted a little bit. We were talking about Ukraine and Russia. Now we're turning to Bible prophecy and we're looking at Jerusalem. So how did this come into play? Well, most of us would know this, but I just want to focus on this plague at the moment. I'll come back to Jerusalem in a sec. So this plague, this is mentioned, that people's flesh will be consumed while they are standing upon their feet, and that their eyes shall be consumed away in their holes, and the tongue shall be consumed away in their mouth. It's talking about an effect of a plague, or the effect that it will have on a human body. And the reason why this is so interesting to look at is because nuclear weapons were used already at the end of the Second World War. And what Zechariah described is actually what was seen, or what happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So they could see the effect of the nuclear blast on the human body, and it's very well described here in Zechariah. And again, this is something written thousands of years ago. In another prophet here, the prophet Joel, when he talks about the day of the Lord, that's another phrase now that we've just introduced, that you'll see why that's mentioned here. It says that there will be wonders shown in the heavens, and it talks about a pillar of smoke. Now, most of us would know that this word here, pillar, of course, translated from the Hebrew, which it was written in, actually means a pillar or a column which is palm-like and spreading at the top. So if we're looking at, say, we're trying to place ourselves in the shoes of Joel the prophet. He sees something and he says, now how will I describe what I've just seen? He can't use the word, it's a nuclear bomb going off, because that's only known in our time. So he sees something, he says, what word will I use in the Hebrew to describe what I've just seen? And the word that he uses means a pillar or column of cloud, which is palm-like, so it's spreading at the top. Now, accurate, is that when you really think about it? That's the word that he chose to use to explain what he saw. God showed him that. He revealed it to him. We all know since the 1950s, I think, 40s or something, we all know what this is. And we all know what it looks like. Now, I have a little clip for you before we mention Khrushchev, who was, the president of USSR during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Any of us remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? And that was a time where, again, the world came very close to, a major conflict which could have spread to become a nuclear conflict. And in this little news clip here, you'll see the son-in-law of Khrushchev speaking and also the son of Khrushchev speaking. This is just a little interesting thing. It's not really connected to the Bible prophecy thing. I just threw it here for a bit of fun. But I just want you to listen and then you'll find out why I put it here.
Khrushchev's reaction was very emotional. Why they can demand us to stop our ships? They do not have any right to do it. So he was very emotional and he did not order the ships to stop.
С тревогой и со злостью. He was alarmed and furious. He was furious with our military, who hadn't hidden it all properly. So he was really furious with the military.
Когда вернулся с Кубы маршал Бирюзов,
when Marshal Biruzov came back from Cuba, they said they could disguise the missiles as palm trees. How they decided that palm trees look like missiles, I don't know. I was astounded, and I asked Father how they do it. He brushed it off and said, well, they're professionals, they know better. When I reminded him about this later, he told me to mind my own business. And that was the end of the discussion.
So just a little interesting point from the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we might not have been aware of, but the Russian military, when reporting to the president of Russia, said that they would disguise the missiles as palm trees. That's what they chose to use as a disguise. Just an interesting little thing, maybe just a bit of fun there, seeing that we know that nuclear weapons do create a palm tree cloud. So, okay, let's get back to Jerusalem. We read before that there will be nations that will fight against Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the most fought over city in the world. Been under siege many times. So when we're looking at Bible prophecy, one of the main parts here is in Ezekiel 38. It talks about peoples that will actually attack Israel. It uses names that we don't know. So we look at this word here, Meshach, look at Tabul, we look at Magog, and we can't open a map and point to these places now. So how do we go about identifying these peoples and these nations now? Where would they be? Who are they talking about? Now, I just want to digress a little bit. If I say Terra Australis, the people know what country I'm talking about. Or if I say Van Diemen's Land, the people know what I'm referring to. If I say New Holland, the people know what I'm talking about. Some of these names, of course, New Holland, was used to describe Australia. And now we don't call it that. But in times past, it would have been a name that people were familiar with. And that's the way you've got to think about these Old Testament names here. Meshach, Tabul, Magog, Tomagar, all these others. They're names that we don't use now, but you can trace them and go back in history. And of course, we have to rely upon historians for this for the most part. But you can see, where they would be today. Maybe it's not an exact science, but it gives us a pretty good picture about who we would be talking about. Who are these nations that would be attacking Jerusalem? Of course, there's many other clues as well. In Ezekiel, it talks about them coming from the north. This means the north of Jerusalem. There will be many people, so it would be a great army of people. So we're looking for nations with great armies in the north from Jerusalem that we're trying to identify. And this is the question. So who are these peoples? Can we identify them readily? So without going to a lot of detail, what we're talking about is the sons of Noah after the flood and where they spread out to. And you can see here one of his sons, Japheth, and his line, his lineage, Gomer, Magog, Tabul, Meshach. These are those nations that were mentioned there in Ezekiel 38. And if we try to follow them through, we generally come to the Slovak people, the Russian people, the Serbian people, and the Balkans. Gomer, Magog, Tabul, etc. So you have to research this, of course. You have to look into it, but it's not something which is not out of reach for any of us to do if we're interested. And this is a depiction here from the Thompson Nelson Bible about where the sons of Noah and their tribes, basically, where they would have spread out to after the flood. And you can just sort of see a little bit here, you know, that Gomer, Javan up the top there in the green, you know, they spread out to these northern areas. Again, we're relying upon historians, I know, but I would argue that we rely upon historians for anything which happened in history. I mean, even regarding Alexandria the Great, or even regarding, you know, a lot of things, we can only rely upon what the historians say, and they don't always agree with each other, of course. But we can, you know, we can access their information or what the conclusions that they've come to. So you'll find references like this, for example, from the Schofield Reference Bible, which states, reference to Meshach and Tabul, Moscow, the Russian capital, it's being stated here as being Meshach, and Tobolsk in Western Siberia is a very clear mark of identification. Okay, so that's quotes from reference material outside, say, of the Revival Fellowship or outside of our own material. So the end of it all is that we believe there's going to be a league of people that will invade Jerusalem, and it will be led by Russia. Okay, that's the point we come to. That's what we believe. And when it talks about a league of nations, or when I refer to a league of nations, we're saying, well, okay, who would these other nations be then? And without going into all the detail again, we generally see Russia being accompanied by Turkey and Iran. It's been known for a while that Iran is very hostile towards Israel. Turkey, on the other hand, is a member of NATO, and you can't say it's completely aligned with Russia, but they have very interesting things or steps that they take. If we were to consider these nations, say they would attack Israel, this is basically the positions of where these nations are and how they would come down upon Israel. And all of these nations do have quite substantial armed forces. Okay, you can see Ukraine here in red, but you can also see another country here in red, which is Syria. Okay, right at the bottom left-hand screen there. And then you can see a little white circle, which is Israel itself. Such a small little speck compared to the rest of it. So if these forces were to join and together they would strike Israel, you could see how much of an overwhelming force they would be. Now, the reason why I've got Syria in this map is because I don't know if we are all familiar with this, but Iran has troops in Syria right now. Iran has had bases in Syria for a long time, military bases. Russia has troops in Syria right now. They have bases there also. The last report that I could find about the number of Russian troops in Syria was from 2019. And the report was that there's 58,000 troops, Russian troops in Syria in 2018 or 19. I can't remember exactly the date. Anybody know the Australian Armed Forces? I think it's around 60 to 70,000 personnel. And from that, what I believe, I didn't check this by the way, I was told this, that we have about 30,000 fighting troops in the Australian Armed Forces. So just to try and compare the amount of troops which Russia has in Syria, it's quite substantial. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, they massed 150,000 troops on their border with Ukraine. Now, Turkey is also involved in Syria. So all the three that I mentioned, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, they are all either in Syria or involved in Syria. And Syria, I was in Israel in 2019. I went to the Sea of Galilee. I looked across the Sea of Galilee and I saw the Golan Heights. It's just so close. No time really, if there was any attack coming from that direction, there would be very little time to respond. So we're talking about Turkey here. Now, Finland and Sweden, you might have read, they decided it would be a good time to join NATO. Okay, they were neutral until now, but they're looking at all the destruction going on in Ukraine, and they think, better we align ourselves with NATO. Now, of course, Russia objects to this, but Turkey, I mentioned, is a member of NATO, and they can actually veto Finland and Sweden joining NATO. They have the power to do so. That's the way NATO is constructed. All the members, existing members, have to agree when they take on new members. And Turkey is objecting to Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Very interesting. Right, to get a full picture, it's because they believe Sweden and Finland might be supporting the Kurds, or have said things to support the Kurds, which Turkey is in conflict with. But again, that's what we hear. The fact of the matter is that they are objecting. And this news clip here, you can see, is from the 24th of May. So just look at the date today. Now we have the 27th. So we're looking at this is a news clip from 3 days ago. Right, and Turkey's president is threatening new incursions into Syria. Like I said, they were operating in Syria to push back the Kurds, which are in Syria, they're in conflict with. But they want to establish a 30-kilometre buffer zone inside Syria. And to do so, they want to put their forces there. So Turkey is also moving or making moves, which would be seeing them to become more aligned with the Russian approach. Okay, that's the main point from that. How are we going with time? I'll have a look. Okay, we should be finishing up very soon. Now, out of all the information that I've shown you tonight, I found this is the one I found the most interesting. I found this on I think it was called Israel Today website. It's a news site from Israel. And it's talking about how US armed forces, so that people who are working for the US military are now forbidden to visit Israel for unofficial reasons, for non-official reasons. Right? This is just in some sort of, I don't know if anyone has ever seen this news. It's from the 27th of April, so it's not that old. But they reconfigured the region which Israel belongs to, according to the US military. This, I think, word he mentioned called CENTCOM. And people working for the US forces are not allowed to visit CENTCOM regions. if they're just going for a holiday or anything else. And the reason is because of COVID. They say that the COVID is so rampant in Israel that that's why the US forces can't visit there if they're there for non-official reasons. But the article goes on to say that the COVID-19 explanation raises further question marks, right? Because Israel itself doesn't lead. It's not a hotspot compared to a lot of other regions where US forces can visit for non-official reasons, or the personnel from those forces. So just out of interest, this is why I find this so interesting, is because the US has decided that they shouldn't have any soldiers or military personnel in Israel unless they're there for an official reason. They're keeping them away from Israel with a flimsy explanation. So it just draws the question for me, is there something more, of course, to this, something that they see that we don't? Okay, so that was just a little piece of interesting information which I found. Okay, so this is the one last clip I've got for you. This is from 60 Minutes. And it's actually referring to an event which took place in 2020. Now, 2020 is when COVID started. So we don't really remember anything which happened before that, right? But in the beginning of 2020, the US killed an Iranian general, right, with a drone strike. I don't know if you can remember that. That was quite a big happening at the time. And Iranians responded by firing a number of missiles at a US base in Iraq. And the interviewer here is interviewing a soldier who was on the base in 2020 when these missiles were raining down on them. And the reason why I'm showing you this clip, because I want you to listen to his summing up of the situation, why nobody died, because there's 2,000 American soldiers on this base. They don't have the adequate bunkers needed for such an attack. They're running between bunkers to try and find cover. 2,000 soldiers, you can imagine, running around trying to find cover, and none of them die. None of them get hit. Quite miraculous. And listen to his explanation as to why.
Now, David Martin on assignment for 60 Minutes.
The U.S. airstrike against Iranian-backed militias Thursday night was the latest chapter in the poisonous relationship with Iran President Biden inherited from the Trump administration. 13 months ago, the two countries came perilously close to war. It began with an American drone strike, which killed Iran's most powerful general, and ended with an Iranian ballistic missile attack against U.S. troops in Iraq. It was the largest ballistic missile attack ever against Americans.
Iranian ballistic missiles began raining down on Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, where 2,000 U.S. troops were based. As a drone recorded the attack, Americans caught in the crosshairs could do nothing but run or duck and cover.
But when you're running between bunkers, it's just a matter of what, luck?
Luck. The only thing I can actually come up with is that the hand of God protected us, because really nobody should have lived through.
Okay, sorry, I just worked out where I can increase the volume from my end in that last clip. So at least you got half of the last clip with full volume. Sorry about that. But this soldier here, when he looks at what happened and he was there and that nobody had died, he can only think it was God's intervention that played out that way. Because you can imagine President Trump was president of the United States during this time. You can imagine if one American soldier was killed, what that could have led to. Now, the reason why I showed you this clip is because it made me, when I first saw this, I got goosepimples, by the way, but it made me just realize that we're all living on borrowed time. I mean, if God didn't intervene in times past, I think we probably would have all been gone by now. We know God is faithful, and we know that he's, calling people home, and he's willing and he's patient to wait for, everybody to come in. But when I see things like this, I think God must be intervening with some of these events which happen in the world and just holding it back. But there will be a time where it is time, and he won't hold it back any longer. So I hope you find that sort of interesting there, that little clip from 60 Minutes. Of course, this is all part of a plan which we're very excited about, because it's the time that Jesus Christ will appear. We talked before, or we mentioned before, the day of the Lord. So the end of the world brings about the return of Jesus Christ to the earth, as many of us would be aware. That's what's in the prophecies. That's what's said is coming. And we're very excited to be able to meet Jesus and to be with him when this all happens. So we're not looking forward to the doom and gloom. We're not looking forward to the destruction or to the death or to the misery all these things will cause, but we are looking forward to being together with the Lord. And we know that if we don't go through these things, that it's necessary to go through these things before we'll see Jesus. There'll be many mothers on the call tonight who have given birth to children. And again, it's a similar situation. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of suffering and agony to give birth. But once the child's there, you forget it all. And this is what we can sort of prepare ourselves mentally to think about these times and Jesus appearing. So yes, the Son of Man coming in the clouds, mentioned in Matthew 24. So what's the conclusion of all these things? Well, point number one is it's time to get right with God. And that's whether you're in the fellowship or you're outside of the fellowship. I suppose President Putin said playtime is over. And maybe that rings true with a lot of us as well. We've got to make sure we're walking the straight and narrow. We've got to make sure that our spirit is built up. The Holy Spirit is built up within inside of us. Because once it starts, once it all happens, we're there. No more we can do anymore. No more preparations. We can do that now. We have our time, but then we won't. If somebody is listening to this, either by the recording or live, and is not part of our fellowship, has not been baptized, has not received the gift of the Holy Ghost, well, that's where you show God that you are getting serious about him. This experience of being born again is something that our members worldwide have done. I've been born again. I've been baptized when I was 16, and I received the Holy Spirit with the Bible evidence of speaking in tongues. And that's what the early church practiced, and that's what the revival fellowship practices as well. So if you're not baptized and not spirit-filled, we would encourage you very much to take those steps, right? You'll find it brings a lot of good into your life and gets you prepared for anything which can come. So the advice for you would be to be born again. But for those of us who've been walking on in the Lord, some of us for many, many years now, these things that we show you and maybe how serious the situation is in the world at the moment is not to get us worried or not to make our heads hang down, right? I got a quote here from Jesus in Luke 21 when he said, okay, when you can see these things begin to pass, I'll look up. And the word that this is translated from in the old Greek, ancient Greek, sorry, means to be elated. Right? Destructions may be at the door or just around the corner, but Jesus is also right behind that. He's just at the door as well. And we should be excited, really should be excited about seeing him and being embraced into his kingdom. You know, it's what we're all waiting for this day, to be able to see it. So we should not be, yes, you know, I suppose, downtrodden because we can see what's coming. We should be looking up. This is what Jesus told us to do. Look up, have this expectation. And once we get there, all right, once we're in the kingdom, everything's going to be new. Everything that we know until now is going to pass away. And that means there'll be no more of this death stuff going on, no more of the crying, no more of the pain. God has taken up a new role for us in the kingdom of heaven. He's going to be walking around with Kleenexes, and anybody who sheds a tear, he's going to go away and wipe it away personally. Right? That's the promise. So, okay, we are going to see a lot of stuff, and we do go through a lot of stuff in life, and we experience these things. We lose people. You know, there's lots of sorrow, lots of heartache. But once we get to the kingdom of God, no more. All these things will have passed away. And that's our hope that we have to look forward to. Okay. Well, brothers and sisters, thank you very much for your time. I know it's a bit longer, but believe me, I could put together a 4-hour presentation for you. This is the shortened version. Okay. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here tonight. And hopefully you've picked up 1 or 2 things from here. I'll hand back over to Pastor Brad.